In the bitter cold of a medieval winter, a father made the unthinkable choice, trading his own daughter to a fearsome Viking jarl in exchange for his village's safety. As Freya is pushed forward, trembling not from the cold but from betrayal, she makes a silent vow that will change everything. She will never bow, never break. What no one could have predicted was the way her defiance would awaken something long buried within the battle-hardened jarl, a man known throughout the northern lands for his merciless raids and iron rule. As she stands tall despite her circumstances, their eyes meet in a moment that sparks the first dangerous ember of connection. She doesn't lower her head, even now, the jarl thinks, watching her with growing fascination. But as the winds of change begin to blow through his fortress, dark forces gather in the shadows, determined to destroy what they cannot understand. Will her courage break the ice around his heart before treachery and blood tear them apart forever? The bitter wind sliced through the gathering like a Norse blade, carrying with it not just the bite of winter, but the weight of betrayal. In the center of the village square, 17-year-old Freya stood trembling, her ash-blonde hair whipping across a face too proud for tears, though they threatened to fall nonetheless. It wasn't the cold that made her body quiver. It was something far worse. The realization that her own father had sold her future for the village's safety. The villagers formed a silent circle around her, their faces masks of pity and relief. Relief that it wasn't their daughters standing where Freya stood. Relief that the raids would end. Relief purchased with a single life, hers. Her father Aldrich, once respected as the village elder, now couldn't meet her eyes. The shame carved deep lines into his weathered face as he placed her small hand into the massive calloused palm of Jarl Ragnar. "She is my offering of peace," Aldrich muttered, his voice breaking like thin ice. "My only daughter, for the safety of our people." With those words, still not looking at the daughter he had raised since her mother died in childbirth, he stepped backward, joining the anonymous safety of the crowd. In that moment, Freya felt something inside her shatter and reform, harder, colder, but unbroken. Jarl Ragnar's reputation had preceded him across the land. Tales of villages burned to cinders, of men slaughtered like cattle, of treasures plundered from monasteries. These stories had reached even their small coastal settlement. The man himself seemed hewn from the very mountains of his homeland. Tall as an oak with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his bloodied legacy. His face, partially hidden behind a thick beard the color of burnt copper, bore scars that told stories of battles survived and enemies conquered. He examined Freya with thinly veiled contempt, his ice blue eyes assessing her as one might evaluate a new horse or hunting hound. "This slip of a girl," he said, his accent thick but his words clear enough. "This is what you offer to appease me?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, fear rekindling. Would he reject the offer? Would the bloodletting begin anew? But something unexpected happened then. Freya, despite the tears now silently streaming down her cheeks, lifted her chin and met the Jarl's gaze directly. It was a small act of defiance, yet in that moment, it ignited something in Ragnar's eyes, the first spark of genuine curiosity. She doesn't lower her head, even now, he thought, though his face remained unreadable. Around them, the villagers exhaled collectively. The offer had not been refused. War had been averted, though at the cost of an innocent soul. The Jarl's silence proved more threatening than any battle cry. He nodded once, sharply, then turned toward the shore where his longship waited, its dragon figurehead seeming to snarl at the villagers in contempt. Two of his warriors flanked Freya, not touching her but making it clear she was to follow. As they marched her toward the ship, Freya heard a small voice call out, her younger cousin, little Elsa, breaking free from her mother's grip to run toward her. "Freya, don't go!" The warriors moved to intercept the child, but Freya turned, kneeling quickly to embrace the girl. "Be brave, little one," she whispered, pressing her wooden pendant, carved by her own mother, into the child's palm. "Remember me?" Then she stood, composed herself, and continued walking, spine straight as a spear, refusing to let her people see her broken. Behind her, Elsa sobbed, clutching the pendant as if it might somehow bring Freya back. The longship's wood creaked beneath her feet as she boarded, feeling the eyes of every villager boring into her back. Not one had stood to defend her, not even her father. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. That night, as the ship sailed northward toward foreign shores, the stars above seemed colder, more distant than they had ever been before. The salt spray stung Freya's face as she sat huddled near the prow, as far from the Vikings as she could manage. They left her alone, more interested in their mead and boasting than in their human cargo. Only the jarl seemed to notice her at all. From his place by the central fire, he observed her silhouette against the night sky, the way she refused to curl into herself despite the cold. The way her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if committing to memory everything she was leaving behind. In the flickering firelight, something unexpected began to stir within him, something he believed had died years ago on another battlefield, buried alongside his faith in humanity. It wasn't compassion, not quite. Perhaps it was recognition. The awareness that this girl-woman possessed a spirit unbroken despite circumstances that would crush most warriors. Freya felt his gaze but refused to acknowledge it. Instead, she made a silent vow to herself, to the stars, to whatever gods might be listening. She would never bow, never break, never become what they expected of her. No king, no jarl, not even the gods themselves would take from her the one thing she still possessed, her will. And as Ragnar watched her reflection in the dancing flames, the firelight catching the untamed determination in her profile, he found himself whispering words he hadn't intended to speak aloud. This woman will learn what silence is, or she will teach me how to listen. The words carried across the deck, barely audible above the creaking of wood and splash of waves. But Freya heard them, and for the first time since being torn from her home, a flicker of something dangerous, something like hope, sparked in her heart. The Viking fortress loomed against the horizon like a beast of stone, its jagged walls rising defiantly from the edge of a cliff that plunged straight into the churning northern sea. Freya stood at the bow of the longship, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden rail, unable to tear her gaze from the formidable structure that was to be her prison. 3 days at sea had left her exhausted, salt-stained and hollow, yet she refused to show weakness before these men who had stolen her from everything she'd ever known. As they approached the stone harbor carved into the cliff base, the sounds of life echoed down from above. The rhythmic pounding of blacksmiths' hammers, the shouts of men, the barking of hounds. Each noise a stark reminder that this place, this world, was not hers. The fortress had been built not just to keep enemies out, but to proclaim dominance over both land and sea. Its towering walls, weathered by centuries of relentless storms, seemed to mock her insignificance. "Welcome to Ravnheim," growled one of the warriors, a brute with a scar splitting his lip from chin to nose. He grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "A pretty cage for the jarl's pretty bird." Freya said nothing, keeping her eyes forward as they docked. The men laughed at her silence, mistaking it for fear. Jarl Ragnar disembarked first, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the wooden planks. He didn't look back to see if she followed. He didn't need to. Where else could she go? The climb up to the fortress was punishing. Narrow steps cut into the very rock of the cliff, slick with sea spray, wound upward in a dizzying spiral. By the time they reached the main gates, Freya's legs burned and her lungs ached. But she had not once asked for rest or assistance. Small victories, she told herself, the only kind available to her now. Inside, the fortress revealed itself as a world unto itself. A sprawling compound of stone buildings, training yards, and smoke-filled halls. Warriors and servants alike paused in their tasks to stare at the newcomer. Women with hard eyes and harder hands. Children who looked like miniature warriors already. Men whose battle scars seemed to compete with one another for prominence. As Freya entered the great hall behind Ragnar, a wave of raucous laughter greeted them. The chamber was filled with warriors, some drinking, others sharpening weapons or playing games of chance with carved bone pieces. The air hung heavy with the smell of mead, sweat, wood smoke, and roasting meat, an assault on senses accustomed to the simpler smells of her fishing village. Your gift trembles so much she's afraid of the very ground, shouted one warrior, pointing at Freya's still unsteady sea legs. The hall erupted in mocking laughter. Ragnar did not acknowledge the comment, moving instead to his high seat at the far end of the hall. Freya stood awkwardly in the center of the room, feeling dozens of predatory eyes assessing her worth, her usefulness. A bearded warrior with bands of silver around his massive arms rose from his bench and approached her, reaching out to touch her hair. Soft, he grunted, grabbing a handful, like summer wheat. His fingers trailed down toward her face. In an instant, before the man's fingers could touch her cheek, Ragnar's voice thundered across the hall. "No one touches what is mine." The words fell heavy as stone, each syllable precise and lethal. The hall silenced immediately. The warrior withdrew his hand as if burned, bowing his head slightly toward Ragnar. "Forgive me, Jarl. I meant no disrespect." Ragnar's gaze remained cold. "Take her to the eastern chamber. See, she's given water to wash." Two serving women appeared at Freya's sides, guiding her through a maze of corridors to a small stone chamber cut into the eastern wall of the fortress. A narrow window overlooked the sea, though it was too small for anything but light and air to pass through. A wooden pallet lined with furs served as a bed. A basin of water sat on a rough-hewn table. The door, thick oak reinforced with iron, closed behind her with a definitive thud. Alone for the first time in days, Freya allowed her composure to crack. She sank onto the pallet, buried her face in her hands, and released silent, racking sobs that shook her slender frame. She cried for her lost home, for her father's betrayal, for the uncertain fate that awaited her. But as twilight deepened outside her window, she wiped away the tears, washed the salt and grime from her face, and steeled herself anew. Weakness was a luxury she could no longer afford. When a serving woman arrived with food, bread still warm from the ovens, salted fish, a chunk of hard cheese, and a cup of watered wine, Freya turned away, refusing to acknowledge the offering. Hours passed. The plate remained untouched. The fortress quieted as night settled fully across the land. The door to her chamber opened without warning. Jarl Ragnar entered, ducking his head beneath the low doorframe. He glanced at the untouched food, then at Freya, who sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her expression carefully neutral. "You haven't eaten," he observed, his voice surprisingly quiet in the small space. The imposing figure who had commanded such immediate obedience in the hall now seemed almost contemplative. "I'm not hungry," Freya replied, the first words she had spoken since leaving her village. 3 days at sea, and now a day without food. You will waste away. Perhaps that's my choice to make." Ragnar studied her, his brow furrowing. "You prefer death by starvation to life here?" Freya met his gaze directly, summoning courage from some hidden reserve. "I prefer to die free than live as property." Something flickered across the Jarl's face, not anger, as she had expected, but something deeper, more complex. The words seemed to reach into him, stirring a memory or feeling he had long suppressed. For a moment he looked almost human rather than the monster of her village's tales. "Freedom," he said finally, "is just another word for a different kind of chain." Without waiting for her response, he turned and left, the door closing firmly behind him. In the corridor outside, one of his most trusted warriors waited. "Will the Saxon woman live to see morning, Jarl?" he asked, hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Ragnar paused, his expression unreadable in the torch-lit passage. "Depends," he said after a long moment. "On what?" pressed the warrior. "On me," Ragnar replied softly, continuing down the corridor alone. That night, as Freya finally succumbed to exhaustion on her pallet, Jarl Ragnar sat alone in his private chambers, a horn of mead untouched before him. His dreams, when sleep finally claimed him, were not of battles or glory as they usually were. Instead, he dreamed of her face, proud, defiant, yet vulnerable, and woke with cold sweat beading on his brow, a sensation of unease he hadn't felt since his first battle many years ago. Something had changed in the fortress of Ravnheim. Something neither its walls nor its warriors were prepared to face. Days melded into one another like iron in a blacksmith's forge, malleable and indistinct. Freya had lost count after the first week, measuring time instead by the rhythm of tasks assigned to her. Each morning began before dawn, when the first pale light spilled through her narrow window, casting long shadows across the stone floor of her chamber. She had learned quickly that to survive in Ravenheim meant to work, to become useful enough to keep, but not valuable enough to notice. The fortress operated like a living creature, each person within its walls fulfilling their role in the greater organism. Warriors trained and hunted, craftsmen forged weapons and built ships, women wove cloth and preserved food for the harsh winter months that would eventually descend upon them. And Freya, she swept the endless stone corridors, fed the snarling hounds that guarded the outer walls, and tended the fires that kept the biting northern chill at bay. Most nights, she collapsed onto her pallet near the kitchen hearth where she now slept, her body aching from labor, her mind too exhausted for the grief that still lingered beneath her waking thoughts. She had not seen the jarl since that night in her chamber, though she felt his presence throughout the fortress, in the watchful eyes of his men, in the whispers that followed her movements, in the way certain doors remained forbidden to her. The servants had begun to accept her presence, if not welcome it. They spoke around her rather than to her, their strange tongue washing over her like waves against rock. She had begun to grasp fragments of their language, simple commands, crude jokes, warnings of the jarl's moods. She absorbed these scraps of knowledge silently, hoarding them like treasures. On this particular evening, Freya had been tasked with sweeping the eastern corridor, a long, drafty passage lined with heavy tapestries depicting battles and gods she did not recognize. The stones beneath her feet had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps, dipping slightly in the center like shallow bowls. She worked methodically, her mind elsewhere, remembering the feel of summer grass beneath bare feet, the taste of fresh bread from her village's ovens, the sound of children playing by the shoreline. Homesickness washed over her with such intensity that she leaned against the wall, momentarily overcome. Without conscious thought, she began to sing, softly at first, then with growing strength, her voice carrying the melody of an old lullaby her mother had sung to her before illness had taken her away. The song spoke of rivers returning to the sea, of birds finding their way home through darkest night, of love that survives beyond death's threshold. She sang in her native tongue, the familiar words a balm to her wounded spirit. The melody wound through the corridor like mist, seeping into the very stones. Freya closed her eyes as she sang, transported briefly back to a world where she was not alone, not captive, not lost. Her voice, clear and sweet, rose and fell with the haunting simplicity of the ancient song. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps, didn't sense the presence until it was too late. When she opened her eyes, Jarl Ragnar stood before her, his massive frame blocking the torchlight. Freya's voice died in her throat, her heart hammering with sudden fear. Had she broken some unspoken rule? Would punishment follow? But the Jarl's expression wasn't angry. He stood perfectly still, his face cast in shadow, yet something in his posture suggested not rage, but attention, as if he had been caught in an invisible current and couldn't break free. "Continue," he said after a moment, his voice surprisingly soft in the silent corridor. Freya hesitated, her throat tight with apprehension. "The song," he clarified. "I would hear it." She swallowed hard, then, with trembling voice, resumed the melody. It emerged weaker at first, then gradually regained its strength as she lost herself once more in the familiar cadence. The Jarl remained motionless, listening. When the final note faded into silence, something had changed in the air between them, something indefinable yet unmistakable. "What words do you sing?" he asked, his accent thickening his speech. "It is a lullaby," Freya answered carefully. "From my homeland, about finding one's way back to where one belongs." The Jarl studied her face in the flickering torchlight. "You believe you will find your way back?" "I believe some part of me will never leave," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. A shadow of something, respect perhaps, or understanding, crossed his weathered features. Without another word, he continued down the corridor, leaving Freya to her broom and her thoughts. That night, as she lay near the kitchen hearth, she heard whispered conversations among the servants. "The Song Witch has cast her spell," one woman murmured. "Did you see how the jarl stood, entranced by her voice? No good will come of it," another replied. "Men bewitched by beauty forget their strength." Freya feigned sleep, but their words nestled in her mind like seeds in dark soil. The following day, as she carried water from the well to the kitchens, she felt eyes upon her. Not the usual curious or dismissive glances, but a harder, more calculating gaze. Looking up, she found herself being watched by Ulfar, the jarl's right-hand man. Unlike Ragnar's weathered face, which carried its scars honestly, Ulfar's features were smooth and handsome, yet somehow false, like a mask worn to conceal something darker beneath. "The Saxon thrush sings prettily," he said, stepping into her path. "But singing birds should remember they are kept in cages for the pleasure of their masters, not to charm the entire hall." His meaning was clear enough, despite the language barrier. Freya lowered her eyes, not out of submission, but to hide the flash of defiance she knew would only provoke him further. The jarl grows distracted. Ulfar continued, circling her slowly. "Songs have power, little thrush. Be careful how you use yours." He left her then, but the warning lingered like poison in the air. That evening, Freya was startled when one of the kitchen women pressed a small loaf of bread into her hands, still warm from the ovens, a luxury she had not been afforded since her arrival. Before she could question the unexpected kindness, the woman gestured toward the far corner of the kitchen where a small figure huddled in shadows. A boy no more than 7 years old, thin as a reed, with eyes too large for his gaunt face. "Orphan," the woman explained in broken Saxon. "No one, like you." Freya understood immediately. Moving carefully so as not to frighten the child, she approached and knelt before him, breaking the bread in half. She offered the larger portion, which he took with trembling hands. As he ate ravenously, she began to hum the lullaby, keeping her voice low but melodic. The boy's eyes remained fixed on her face, his expression gradually softening from wariness to something approaching wonder. What Freya didn't see was the shadow that fell across the doorway, the silent figure of Jarl Ragnar, watching the exchange from darkness. He observed how she shared what little she had been given, how her voice gentled the feral-eyed orphan boy, how something luminous and pure seemed to radiate from her despite the circumstances that had brought her to his shores. The sight destroyed any lingering suspicions he might have harbored about manipulation or witchcraft. This was no calculated performance, no attempt to bewitch or beguile. This was simply who she was, and that realization disturbed him far more than any suspected sorcery might have. He withdrew without making his presence known, retreating to his private chambers where maps and war plans awaited his attention. But concentration eluded him. The song echoed in his mind, weaving between thoughts of conquest and strategy, undermining his focus. Outside his window, the sea crashed against the cliffs, relentless and eternal. He listened to its roar, seeking the comfort of its familiar voice, but found instead that he was straining to hear the distant notes of Freya's lullaby, carried through the stone corridors like a ghost. Sleep did not come to him that night. Her song wound through his consciousness, mingling with the sound of waves until he could no longer distinguish between the two, both calling to something buried deep within him, something he had long believed dead and gone. As dawn's first light crept across the horizon, Jarl Ragnar made a decision. He summoned his personal guard and issued a command that startled even his most loyal men. Bring the Saxon woman to the Great Hall at midday. Unharmed. The warriors exchanged glances, uncertain whether they were delivering her to honor or execution. The Great Hall of Ravenheim buzzed with anticipation, warriors and servants alike gathering to witness whatever spectacle their jarl had summoned them for. Smoke curled upward from the central hearth, disappearing into the rafters where ravens, the jarl's namesake birds, perched like silent harbingers. Weapons hung from the walls alongside trophy shields taken from fallen enemies, each telling its own tale of conquest. Carved wooden pillars depicting the gods and their exploits supported the high ceiling, their faces watching the proceedings with eternal, unseeing eyes. Two of Ragnar's guards escorted Freya through the throng, their expressions giving nothing away. She walked between them with measured steps, her heart thundering against her ribs, though her face remained composed. The past weeks had taught her that displays of fear only invited further torment. She wore the same simple woolen dress she had arrived in, now mended in several places, her hair bound in a single braid that hung down her back. No ornament adorned her, yet something in her carriage, a dignity that transcended circumstance, made her stand out amidst the crowd. As they approached the high seat, conversation died away. Jarl Ragnar sat upon his carved oak throne, his massive frame seeming too large for even such an imposing seat. His beard had been freshly trimmed, his hair, the color of fire and smoke, pulled back from his face. He wore no crown, but authority radiated from him like heat from flame. The guards positioned Freya before him, then stepped back, leaving her alone in the center of the hall. Hundreds of eyes watched, hungry for drama, for punishment, for blood. She felt their collective gaze like a physical weight pressing down upon her shoulders. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring until Ragnar finally spoke, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the hall. "They say you sing to break my walls," he said, a hint of something almost like amusement softening his usual stern expression. The accusation hung in the air, though his tone lacked the expected menace. Freya raised her eyes to meet his directly, a breach of protocol that caused a ripple of muttered disapproval among the onlookers. But she had made a promise to herself that first night on the longship, never to bow her head in submission, no matter the cost. "No, my lord," she replied, her voice clear despite her fear. "I sing to keep my own from falling." Her answer silenced the murmurs. The warriors exchanged glances, confusion evident on their faces. Such words made no sense to men whose understanding of strength came from shield and sword. But something in Ragnar's expression shifted, a subtle change, as if pieces of a puzzle had suddenly aligned. For the first time since her arrival, the Jarl smiled, not the fierce grin of a warrior anticipating battle, but something gentler, more genuine. It transformed his face, revealing glimpses of a man who might have existed before war and power had claimed him. The smile was brief, there and gone like sunlight through storm clouds, but unmistakable. Several of his men shifted uncomfortably, unsettled by this unfamiliar expression on their leader's face. "They also say," Ragnar continued, rising from his seat to descend the dais steps, "that your hands heal as sweetly as your voice sings." He moved toward her with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to physical power. "Is this true?" Freya hesitated. During her time in the fortress, she had occasionally tended minor injuries among the kitchen staff, using knowledge passed down from her mother. Poultices of herbs, clean bandaging, proper setting of small fractures. She hadn't realized these small mercies had been noted, reported. "I know some healing ways," she admitted carefully. "Nothing more than what most women of my village know." Ragnar nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "We have wounded," he said, "many wounded, from the southern raids. If you are as pure as your song suggests, prove it." His words rang with challenge, though not cruelty. "You wish me to tend your warriors?" Freya asked, surprise momentarily overcoming her caution. "I wish to see if your compassion extends beyond orphaned boys and kitchen maids," he replied, his voice too low for any but her to hear. The implication was clear. He had seen her with the orphan boy, had witnessed her small acts of kindness. Nothing escaped his notice within these walls. "I will tend any who need it," she said simply. Wounded flesh knows no allegiance. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. With a gesture, he summoned his steward and issued commands in their native tongue. The crowd parted, and Freya was led from the hall toward the western wing of the fortress where, she soon discovered, a makeshift infirmary had been established. The scene that greeted her caused her steps to falter. More than 20 men lay on pallets spread across the stone floor of what must have once been a storeroom. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood, the sour smell of infection, the muted groans of pain. These were not minor injuries. These were the brutal aftermath of battle. Missing limbs, deep sword gashes, arrow wounds turned septic. "Your challenge is here," said the steward, gesturing toward the suffering men. The jarl watches to see what you will do. Freya's first instinct was to flee. This task was beyond her simple village healing. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw not fearsome warriors, but suffering humans. Setting her jaw with determination, she rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She labored until sunset, moving from pallet to pallet. She cleaned festering wounds, sewed gashes with careful stitches, set broken bones with improvised splints. She requested herbs from the kitchens, many of which, to her surprise, were provided. Her hands grew stained with blood, her dress soiled beyond saving, her back aching from hours bent over broken bodies. Some men died beneath her care, too far gone for her limited skills to save. For these, she closed their eyes and whispered prayers from her homeland, ignoring the suspicious glances this earned her from the Norse healers. Others began to show improvement even within those few hours, fever breaking, breathing easing, pain diminishing under her careful ministrations. As dusk deepened into night, warriors came to watch her work, first with skepticism, then with growing respect. They observed how she spoke gently to their wounded comrades, how she showed no disgust at the worst injuries, how she worked without complaint or rest. By nightfall, several had begun to assist her, fetching clean water, holding lanterns so she could see, translating her instructions to those too delirious to understand her broken Norse. Through it all, she sang softly, lullabies from her childhood, healing songs taught by village-wise women, melodies that required no translation to soothe troubled minds. The chamber, which had earlier echoed with cries of pain, gradually settled into an almost peaceful quiet, punctuated only by her gentle voice. She didn't notice Jarl Ragnar standing in the doorway, watching. He observed for nearly an hour as she tended a young warrior barely 16 winters old, who had lost an arm to a Saxon axe. The boy had been given up for dead by the Norse healers, infection having set into the stump. Yet under Freya's care, the angry red flesh had begun to cool, the fever to subside. She spoke to the semi-conscious youth as she might to a younger brother, her voice steady and reassuring despite her exhaustion. Ragnar withdrew without making his presence known, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, an emotion he had not permitted himself to feel in many years. Freya continued working until she could no longer keep her eyes open. Having done all she could for those under her care, she finally allowed herself to rest, curling up on the floor beside the pallet of the young one-armed warrior whose breathing had finally steadied. She meant to close her eyes for only a moment, but exhaustion claimed her completely. She did not feel herself being lifted, did not notice being carried through torch-lit corridors to her small chamber, did not see the rare gentleness in the jarl's face as he laid her on her pallet, covered her with his own fur-lined cloak, its fabric rich with embroidered patterns and the scent of cedar. When morning light spilled through her window, Freya woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. As awareness returned, she felt something heavy and warm covering her, something far too fine for a servant's bed. Sitting up, she found herself wrapped in a magnificent cloak, its dark fabric intricately decorated with symbols of ravens and wolves. Her fingers traced the patterns with wonder, recognition dawning slowly. In the center of the embroidered design was the personal emblem of Jarl Ragnar himself. The fortress of Ravenheim gradually transformed with the changing season. Winter's grip loosened, allowing the first tentative signs of spring to emerge along the rocky coastline. Pale green shoots pushed through frost-hardened earth, and the days stretched longer, the sun lingering a bit more generously with each passing week. Within the stone walls, subtle changes unfolded as well, none more notable than the shifting dynamics between the Saxon captive and her Viking captor. Since the night Freya had tended the wounded, her position had altered in ways both visible and unseen. The Jarl's cloak, returned respectfully but promptly the morning after she'd found it covering her, had served as a silent declaration. Though no words had been spoken, the message was clear to all within the fortress. The Saxon woman stood under Ragnar's protection. Servants who had previously ignored her now acknowledged her presence with nods or brief greetings. Warriors who once eyed her with contempt now regarded her with cautious respect. Even the cook, a battle axe of a woman with arms like tree trunks, had begun saving choice portions of bread or meat for the healer, as Freya was now commonly called. But it was Ragnar himself whose behavior had undergone the most profound transformation. He watched her, not openly, but in moments he thought unobserved. When she crossed the courtyard carrying herbs for the still recovering wounded, when she sat by the fire mending torn clothing, when she spoke in her gradually improving Norse with the fortress children. His gaze followed her with a quality that those closest to him recognized with growing unease. Not the predatory assessment of a jarl evaluating property, but something far more dangerous: curiosity. For her part, Freya found herself studying him as well, though more cautiously. She observed how he listened intently during council meetings while others spoke, rather than simply imposing his will. She noticed how he trained tirelessly with his men, but never used his superior strength to humiliate a weaker opponent. She saw how children ran to him rather than away, and how even the massive wolfhounds that patrolled the fortress perimeter gentled under his hand. These glimpses contradicted everything she had been told about the fearsome Jarl Ragnar, the merciless raider of coastal villages, the bloodthirsty Viking whose name mothers used to frighten disobedient children. The man she observed was complex, capable of both terrible violence and unexpected mercy. This realization troubled her more than simple fear had. It was easier to hate a monster than to understand a man. One evening, as Freya returned from gathering early spring herbs beyond the fortress walls, a privilege recently granted that still surprised her, she heard the unmistakable sounds of pain. Not the open groans of the wounded she had tended, but the muffled, prideful suffering of someone determined not to show weakness. Following the sound, she found herself near the Jarl's private chambers, an area she had been careful to avoid. Hesitation froze her in place. To approach uninvited might be seen as presumption at best, intrusion at worst. Yet the healer in her, the part that had tended injuries since childhood, pushed her forward. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. No answer came, but another poorly concealed sound of pain decided her. She pushed the door open, entering a realm few in Ravenheim ever saw. The Jarl's chambers were surprisingly austere. No gold-laden chests or plundered treasures adorned the space. A simple bed, larger than most but unadorned, a table covered with maps and carved figures representing troops and ships. Weapons hung on walls alongside intricately woven tapestries depicting not battles, as she might have expected, but scenes of the sea, forests, and what appeared to be family lineages. Ragnar stood with his back to her, stripped to the waist, attempting to reach a wound on his shoulder. Blood seeped from a deep gash, running in rivulets down his muscled back. He turned at her entrance, surprise briefly overwhelming the pain in his expression. "Out," he commanded, though with less force than his usual battlefield voice. Freya remained where she stood, her healer's eye assessing the wound rather than obeying the order. "That needs cleaning and binding," she said simply. "It will fester otherwise." "Leave," he repeated, though something in his tone suggested he expected her to disobey. "Not before I tend that wound," she replied, moving forward with the quiet confidence that had begun to define her presence in Ravenheim. Setting down her gathered herbs, she approached him without waiting for permission. "Sit," she instructed, gesturing toward a nearby stool. For a moment, the absurdity of their reversed positions, captive commanding captor, hung in the air between them. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been amusement, and he sat. Freya worked in silence at first, cleaning the wound with water from a basin nearby. It was deep, the work of a training sword that had found its mark despite the Jarl's legendary skill. As she examined it more closely, she noticed other scars across his torso and back, a map of violence written on skin, some ancient and faded, others more recent. "You carry many battles with you," she observed, preparing a poultice from some of her gathered herbs. "Every warrior does," he replied, wincing slightly as she applied the mixture to the open wound. "This will sting," she warned, too late, "but it will prevent corruption of the blood." As she worked, binding the shoulder with strips of clean linen, she became aware of other presences in the room, ghosts that seemed to hover just beyond sight. Not physical apparitions, but memories that filled the space with almost palpable grief. "You live alone," she said. Not a question, but an observation. "Yet this room feels—" She searched for the right word. "Inhabited." Ragnar's body tensed beneath her hands. For a moment she feared she had overstepped, broken whatever fragile trust had formed between them. But then he spoke, his voice low, as if the words emerged without his conscious permission. "My wife, my son, they were here. Once." The simple statement contained volumes of loss. Freya's hands stilled momentarily before continuing their work, more gently now. "What happened?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be steeped in the same violence that scarred his body. "War," he answered, the single word laden with bitterness. "Saxon raiders, while I was away fighting in the east." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had hardened. "I returned to find my home burned, my family slaughtered. Since then, I have killed everything that remained of the man I was." The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected, unplanned, yet somehow inevitable. Freya finished binding the wound in silence, absorbing the weight of what he had shared. Understanding bloomed within her, not justification for the raids on her village and others, but context for the man behind them. "You blame all Saxons," she said quietly, moving to stand before him. "I did," he acknowledged, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected honesty. "Until a Saxon woman healed warriors who had destroyed her home. Until she showed more mercy than I have known in 10 winters." The admission struck Freya like a physical blow. Without thinking, she placed her palm against his chest, directly over his heart. "Then perhaps it is time," she said softly, "to live again." Ragnar's expression shifted through disbelief, resistance, and then, briefly, vulnerability so acute it transformed his battle-hardened features. He attempted to laugh, but the sound emerged broken, unsteady. "You speak as if it were simple," he said, his voice rough with emotion he clearly hadn't intended to reveal. "Not simple," Freya replied, "but possible." For a long moment, neither moved. Something profound and dangerous passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two souls scarred by loss, standing at the edge of possibility. The spell broke when footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Ragnar stood, his warrior's mask slipping back into place with practiced ease. Freya stepped away, gathering her herbs, reclaiming her role as servant rather than equal. As she moved toward the door, Ragnar spoke once more. "No one is to approach you," he said, his tone making it clear this was not suggestion but command. "No one touches what is under my protection." She paused at the threshold, turning back to face him. "Is that what I am now? Protected rather than captive?" "You are," he began, then seemed to search for words that eluded him. "You are something I cannot name." That night, Ragnar issued the order throughout Ravenheim. The Saxon healer was not to be approached without his explicit permission. None knew what had transpired behind his chamber door, but speculation ran rampant through the fortress. Whispered conversations that fell silent whenever either the jarl or Freya appeared. But one man did not whisper. One man watched with cold calculation as patterns shifted and power realigned. Ulfar, who had stood at Ragnar's right hand through 100 battles, observed his jarl's growing preoccupation with mounting concern. That night, in the privacy of his own quarters, he swore a solemn oath before his personal shrine to Odin. He would see Ragnar restored to his former glory and strength, freed from whatever spell the Saxon woman had cast, even if that meant removing her permanently. The northern wind changed its song as winter relinquished its final hold on Ravenheim. No longer did it howl with ice-laden fury. Instead, it whispered warnings across the fortress walls, carrying with it the scent of coming change. Freya had learned to read such signs during her months of captivity, the subtle shifts in air that preceded storms, the particular quality of silence before conflict erupted. And now, despite the gradual warming of the season, a different kind of chill permeated the fortress. She felt it first in glances that followed her movements, not the usual curious or respectful acknowledgments she had grown accustomed to, but something sharper, more calculating. Warriors who had begun to nod in greeting now turned away as she approached. Conversations halted mid-sentence when she entered rooms. Even the serving women, some of whom had almost become friends, maintained a new distance, their eyes averted, their interactions brief. "They fear what they do not understand," said Hilda, one of the few kitchen women who still spoke openly with Freya. Her gnarled hands kneaded dough with practiced efficiency as they talked in the relative privacy of the early morning kitchen. A Saxon woman who heals Viking warriors, a captive who walks freely, a slave who meets the jarl's eye without flinching. She glanced up, her weathered face serious, and a jarl who watches her as a man watches a woman, not as a master observes property. "You speak dangerous words," Freya replied quietly, grinding herbs with a stone mortar. The rhythmic motion helped steady her thoughts. Hilda snorted, unimpressed by the warning. "Dangerous times breed dangerous words. There are whispers, girl, whispers that grow louder each day." "What whispers?" Freya asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "That Ragnar the Fearless has lost his edge, that his sword arm weakens while his heart softens." Hilda lowered her voice further. "That the Saxon thrush has enchanted him with songs and healing hands, making him forget his true purpose." Freya's hands stilled. "That's foolishness. The Jarl remains as he was." "Does he?" Hilda challenged, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "He who once led raids with every thaw now speaks of trade agreements. He who demanded tribute from every coastal village now discusses boundaries and peaceful settlements. And he who once took what he wanted without hesitation now watches a Saxon captive from afar, never approaching, never claiming." Heat rose to Freya's cheeks. "You mistake courtesy for weakness, wisdom for softness." "I mistake nothing," Hilda replied firmly. "But others do. And mistakes in places of power often end in blood." She patted Freya's hand, leaving a dusting of flour on the younger woman's skin. "Watch your shadow, child. Not all enemies announce themselves with drawn swords." The warning followed Freya throughout the day, sharpening her awareness of the subtle currents flowing through Ravnheim. She noticed now what she had been too preoccupied to see, the way the warriors had begun to separate into factions, some still fiercely loyal to Ragnar, others gravitating toward Ulfar. The latter group had grown more numerous, their expressions more open in their discontent. Ulfar himself maintained a careful distance from Freya, though she often felt his cold gaze tracking her movements across the fortress grounds. Unlike Ragnar's watchful attention, which carried a quality that made her skin warm, Ulfar's observation left her chilled to the bone. Where the Jarl looked at her with growing understanding, his second-in-command assessed her as one might evaluate a threat, calculating weaknesses, planning elimination. That afternoon, Freya ventured beyond the fortress walls to gather fresh water from a nearby spring. The path wound through scrubby pines that clung tenaciously to the rocky soil, their needles of vibrant green against the gray stone landscape. She welcomed these brief excursions, moments of solitude away from the oppressive weight of constant observation. The spring bubbled from between two massive boulders, its water crystal clear and achingly cold. Freya knelt beside it, filling her wooden bucket carefully. The task complete, she paused to enjoy a moment's peace, closing her eyes to listen to the gentle music of flowing water. The sound of footsteps came too late for warning. A rough hand clamped over her mouth while another seized her arm, dragging her backward into the shelter of the pines. Freya fought instinctively, kicking and twisting against her assailant, but a second set of hands joined the first, and she found herself pinned against the frozen ground, looking up into the faces of two of Ulfar's most loyal warriors. "The thrush sings too sweetly," one said, his breath reeking of sour ale. "Time to clip her wings." The second warrior laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Ulfar says to make it look like an accident. She wandered too far, fell on the ice." Tragic, but these things happen to careless slaves. Freya's mind raced even as her body continued to struggle. She had no weapon, no hope of physically overpowering two trained warriors. Her only chance lay in being heard. But who would come this far from the fortress walls? Who would hear a scream cut short by violence? As if reading her thoughts, the first warrior pressed his hand more firmly against her mouth. "No one to hear you, Saxon. No one to save you this time." With brutal efficiency, they dragged her toward the edge of a rocky outcropping where the ground fell away sharply to jagged stones below. The perfect place for a fatal accident, a slip on treacherous ice, a broken neck on the rocks below. Her death would raise few questions, prompt few investigations, just another slave who met an unfortunate end. Desperation gave Freya strength she didn't know she possessed. As they neared the edge, she went suddenly limp, causing her captors to momentarily adjust their grip. In that instant of recalibration, she twisted violently, sinking her teeth into the hand that covered her mouth. The warrior howled in pain, reflexively releasing her. She used the moment to drive her elbow into the second man's stomach, breaking free of his grasp just long enough to scramble away from the precipice. "Bitch!" the bitten warrior snarled, blood streaming between his fingers. "You'll suffer for that before you die." Freya backed away, knowing she couldn't outrun them, but unwilling to surrender to death without a fight. Her heel struck the abandoned water bucket, sending it rolling across the icy ground. The small sound seemed amplified in the tense silence, a futile cry for help in a deserted place. The warriors advanced slowly now, confident in their advantage, savoring her fear. Freya continued to retreat until her back pressed against the rough trunk of a pine tree. Trapped. She closed her eyes briefly, searching for courage in what she knew would be her final moments. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My gods await me. Can you say the same of yours?" Her defiance seemed to enrage them further. The bitten warrior lunged forward, seizing her by the throat with his uninjured hand. "Your gods are weak. They cannot save you here." "No," came a voice like thunder from behind them. "But I can." The grip on Freya's throat loosened as both warriors turned in shock. There, massive against the pale sky, stood Jarl Ragnar. Snow dusted his shoulders and beard, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. In his right hand, he held his legendary axe, its edge catching the weak winter sunlight. "My lord," the second warrior began, his voice tight with sudden fear, "we found the Saxon wandering beyond the permitted boundaries. We were returning her to—" "Silence," Ragnar interrupted, the single word striking with more force than a physical blow. His gaze moved from the warriors to Freya, noting the forming bruises on her neck, the torn sleeve of her dress, the terror still evident in her eyes despite her brave words. Something dark and ancient transformed his features, the battle rage that had made his name feared across northern lands. "You dare," he said, each word precise and deadly, "to lay hands on what is mine." What followed happened so quickly that Freya could barely comprehend it. Ragnar moved with a speed belied by his size, closing the distance between himself and the warriors in two massive strides. The axe rose and fell once, twice. Blood sprayed across the snow, shockingly bright against the pristine white. Both men lay crumpled at his feet, their expressions frozen in permanent surprise. Ragnar stood motionless for a moment, his chest heaving not from exertion but from the force of his fury. When he turned to Freya, his eyes still burned with battle light, making him appear almost otherworldly. A god of war stepped down from Asgard itself. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice gentler than she would have thought possible after such violence. Unable to speak past the knot of emotion in her throat, Freya simply shook her head. Her legs gave way then, the delayed reaction to fear making her collapse against the tree trunk. In 2 steps, Ragnar was beside her, gathering her against his chest as effortlessly as if she were made of air rather than flesh and bone. She didn't resist, too overwhelmed by the nearness of death and the sudden visceral safety of his presence. "How did you find me?" she managed to ask as he carried her away from the bloodied snow, leaving the dead warriors for the ravens that already circled overhead. "I watch over what matters to me," he answered simply. As they approached the fortress gates, Freya became aware of the implications of their return. Her in the jarl's arms, his axe bloodied, her clothing torn. The entire fortress would witness this unmistakable declaration. Whatever whispered rumors had circulated before would now become shouts. At the gates, Ragnar paused, his gaze sweeping the gathered onlookers until it found Ulfar, who stood watching with barely concealed rage. The two men locked eyes across the courtyard, a silent battle of wills that needed no words to articulate the challenge presented and accepted. Who dared? Ragnar's voice boomed across the suddenly silent yard, though his question was clearly directed at his second in command. Ulfar's expression remained carefully neutral. My lord? Who dared to raise a hand against her? Ragnar clarified, his arms tightening protectively around Freya. I cannot say. Ulfar replied smoothly. Perhaps disgruntled warriors who remember when Ravenheim valued strength over Saxon slaves, when our jarl led raids instead of nursemaiding captured thralls. The insult hung in the air, blatant and undeniable. A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered crowd. No one had ever spoken to Ragnar with such open disrespect and lived to see the following dawn. Ragnar's face revealed nothing as he carefully set Freya on her feet, keeping one hand at her waist to steady her. When he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the courtyard with quiet, lethal clarity. Hear me now, all of Ravenheim. Whoever raises a hand against this woman raises it against me. Today, 2 warriors learned this lesson at the edge of my axe. Let no one require further demonstration. His gaze returned to Ulfar, the challenge unmistakable. Tonight, we hold council. All warriors will attend. I have decisions to announce that concern the future of Ravenheim and all who sail under its banner. With that, he guided Freya into the fortress, leaving behind a courtyard humming with the beginnings of open conflict. That night, Ulfar gathered his most loyal followers in the shadows of the weapons room, their voices low, their expressions grim. They swore blood oaths by firelight. The jarl had shown his weakness for all to see. The time had come to restore Ravenheim to its former glory, even if it meant removing Ragnar from his throne. The darkness before dawn held Ravenheim in its grip, the fortress slumbering beneath a blanket of stars. Only the night guards remained vigilant, their torches flickering against the vast blackness of the northern sky. In such stillness, the first sounds of betrayal came as whispers, the soft scrape of sword against scabbard, the muted footfalls of men moving with deadly purpose, the quiet creak of doors opened with cautious hands. Freya woke suddenly, torn from sleep by some instinct beyond conscious thought. For several heartbeats, she lay motionless on her pallet, listening to the unnatural silence. The usual night sounds of the fortress, distant laughter from late drinking warriors, the barking of watchdogs, the crackle of hearth fires, had vanished, replaced by an absence so complete it seemed to press against her ears like physical pressure. Something was wrong. She rose silently, wrapping her woolen shawl around her shoulders against the night's chill. Since the incident at the spring, Ragnar had moved her from the servants' quarters to a small chamber near his own, close enough for protection, yet still maintaining a distance that acknowledged propriety. This placement, intended as sanctuary, now placed her at the heart of whatever danger approached. Carefully, she eased open her door and peered into the corridor. Darkness met her gaze, the usual torches extinguished. She hesitated at the threshold, torn between the relative safety of her chamber and the growing certainty that something terrible was unfolding within the fortress walls. A distant sound made the decision for her, the unmistakable clash of steel against steel, followed by a shout abruptly silenced. Fighting had erupted somewhere deeper in the fortress, and in the direction of those sounds lay Ragnar's chambers. Moving on instinct rather than reason, Freya slipped into the corridor, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. She navigated by memory and touch, one hand trailing along the rough wall for guidance. The sounds of conflict grew louder as she approached the juncture where her corridor met the main passage leading to the jarl's private quarters. Pausing at the corner, she risked a glance around the edge. What she saw froze her blood. The main corridor blazed with torchlight, illuminating a scene of chaotic violence. At least 20 warriors clashed in the confined space, their weapons flashing in the golden light. She recognized Ulfar at the center of the attacking force, his face transformed by battle rage and triumph as he drove forward against the dwindling number of Ragnar's loyal guards. The jarl has grown weak, Ulfar shouted above the din of combat. Ravenheim deserves a leader who remembers our ways, who will bring us glory, not shame. His words rallied his followers, who pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. The loyal guards fell back step by step toward Ragnar's chamber door, their numbers diminishing with each passing moment. Freya withdrew around the corner, her mind racing. The revolt that had been brewing in whispers and sidelong glances had finally erupted into open violence. Ulfar had made his move, choosing the vulnerability of night to strike against a jarl he believed weakened by mercy and distracted by a foreign captive. A sudden crash and triumphant shouts told her that the last defenders had fallen. Heavy footsteps approached Ragnar's door, followed by the splintering sound of wood giving way beneath determined force. "Bring him alive," Ulfar commanded. "He deserves to witness his shame before meeting his end." Freya pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. What could she do against 20 armed warriors? What difference could one unarmed woman make against such overwhelming force? The sounds from within Ragnar's chamber answered her unspoken question. The crash of furniture overturned, the clang of weapons meeting in desperate combat, a roar of defiance that could only come from the jarl himself, fighting for his life against insurmountable odds. Certainty crystallized within her. She might not be able to defeat Ulfar's warriors, but neither would she hide in safety while the man who had shown her mercy faced death alone. If this night ended in blood, and she had little doubt it would, then let her courage match that of the one who had protected her. Her gaze fell upon a torch mounted in an iron bracket nearby, one of the few still burning in this section of the corridor. A desperate plan formed in her mind, not a warrior's strategy, but a trapped animal's bid for survival. She reached up and took the torch, its flame dancing wildly with the movement. Moving with newfound purpose, Freya hurried to the end of the corridor where massive tapestries hung from ceiling to floor, ancient weavings depicting the glory of Ravenheim's past victories. Dry with age and made from wool treated with oils to preserve their vibrant colors, they would burn like kindling once touched by flame. She hesitated only a moment, offering a silent apology to the artisans whose work she was about to destroy. Then, with a swift motion, she touched the torch to the bottom edge of the largest tapestry. The flame caught instantly, racing upward with hungry eagerness, consuming decades of history in seconds. Freya didn't wait to watch the destruction unfold. Already the corridor filled with smoke, the fire spreading from one hanging to the next with terrifying speed. She ran toward Ragnar's chambers, the torch still clutched in her hand, a weapon of last resort against whatever awaited her. The scene that greeted her as she rounded the final corner surpassed even her worst fears. Ragnar stood surrounded, his back against the far wall of his chamber, bleeding from multiple wounds yet still defiant. 5 of Ulfar's men lay dead or dying at his feet, testament to the jarl's legendary fighting prowess, but at least a dozen more pressed inward, determined to finish what their leader had begun. Ulfar himself stood slightly apart, savoring the moment of his impending triumph, his sword ready for the killing blow once his men had worn down their former leader. "Flee!" Ragnar shouted when he saw Freya in the doorway, his voice hoarse with effort and emotion. His eyes meeting hers across the chaos held not fear for himself, but terror for her safety. Instead of retreating, Freya raised the torch high and shouted with all the strength her lungs could muster, "Fire! The fortress burns!" Her cry, coupled with the growing roar of flames now consuming the ancient tapestries and licking at the wooden roof beams beyond, caused momentary confusion among Ulfar's men. Several turned toward the doorway, their discipline fracturing at this unexpected development. Seizing the opportunity created by their distraction, Freya hurled the torch directly at the ropes securing a massive weapons rack to the wall. The flames caught the oil-soaked hemp instantly. With a groan of straining wood and a sharp snap of burning fiber, the entire structure collapsed, sending swords, axes, and spears crashing down between Ragnar and his attackers, creating a momentary barrier of fallen weapons and confusion. "This way!" Freya cried, gesturing frantically toward the doorway, where smoke now billowed in thick clouds. Ragnar didn't hesitate. With a final defiant roar at his would-be usurpers, he vaulted over the fallen weapons rack and charged toward the exit, cutting down 2 warriors who moved to intercept him. Together, he and Freya plunged into the smoke-filled corridor, the heat of the growing inferno pressing against them like a living entity. "You've set my fortress ablaze," Ragnar observed, his tone caught between disbelief and grim appreciation as they ran through the thickening smoke. "I needed a distraction," Freya replied, coughing as acrid smoke filled her lungs. It seemed appropriate, fire against treachery. Behind them, shouts of alarm and confusion echoed as Ulfar's men realized the danger had transformed from political coup to immediate survival. The fire, fed by ancient timbers and tapestries, had taken firm hold of the eastern wing of the fortress, spreading with a speed that suggested divine intervention or divine retribution. They had nearly reached the relative safety of the main courtyard when Ragnar stumbled, a fresh wave of blood darkening his tunic from a wound Freya hadn't noticed in the chaos. She caught him reflexively, her slight frame somehow finding strength to support his massive weight. "Leave me," he gasped, his face ashen beneath the blood and soot. "Save yourself. This is my battle, my end." "No," Freya replied, the single word containing all the determination she had cultivated during months of captivity. "Someone needs to survive this night to learn how to live again. Remember?" Using strength born of desperation, she half-carried, half-dragged him through the final archway and into the open courtyard. The pre-dawn sky had begun to lighten in the east, casting an eerie glow across the scene of confusion that greeted them. Warriors and servants alike ran in all directions, some fighting the spreading flames, others simply fleeing for their lives. The fortress that had stood for generations against external enemies now faced destruction from within, both from Ulfar's betrayal and the fire Freya had ignited to combat it. In the center of the courtyard, Ragnar sank to his knees, his strength finally deserting him. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the dim light. Freya knelt beside him, her hands desperately trying to locate and staunch his wounds. Looking up at her through pain-clouded eyes, Ragnar asked the question that had perhaps been inevitable since the moment she'd been brought before him as an offering of peace. "Why did you save me?" Freya's hands stilled against his bloodied chest. In the growing light of dawn, with flames consuming the fortress behind them and uncertain future stretching before them, truth seemed the only offering worth giving. "Because someone needs to survive to learn how to love," she answered, her voice steady despite the tears that tracked clean lines through the soot on her face. Something profound and transformative passed over Ragnar's features. The hardened warrior, the feared jarl, the man who had built walls around his heart thicker than those surrounding his fortress, all seemed to crumble in that moment, giving way to something long buried beneath grief and vengeance. He lowered his head, and tears, perhaps the first he had shed since losing his family, mingled with the blood and ash on his face. For a heartbeat, the world around them faded into insignificance. The burning fortress, the shouting warriors, the approaching dawn, all receded before the magnitude of what passed between them in that silent moment of recognition. The spell broke when Freya suddenly slumped forward against his chest, her eyes closing, her body limp in unconscious surrender. Only then did Ragnar notice the spreading stain on her back, blood seeping through the thin fabric of her dress from a wound she had received in their desperate escape, a wound she had ignored in her determination to bring him to safety. With a cry of anguish that cut through the chaos around them, Ragnar gathered her into his arms, cradling her unconscious form against his chest. Looking down at his blood-stained hands, hands that had taken countless lives, hands now desperately trying to preserve the one life that had awakened him from years of emotional death, he made a silent vow to whatever gods might be listening. If she survived, he would become worthy of the sacrifice she had made. If she lived, he would learn again what it meant to be not just a warrior, but a man. Days blurred together in a haze of pain and flickering consciousness. Freya drifted between worlds, sometimes aware of gentle hands tending her wound, sometimes lost in fevered dreams where fire consumed everything she'd ever known. Voices reached her through the fog, unfamiliar words in the Norse tongue, spoken with urgency and concern. Occasionally, a deeper voice cut through the others, its tone commanding even in whispers. In her lucid moments, she recognized it as Ragnar's, though she couldn't comprehend the words. When Freya finally emerged fully from the fever's grip, the first sensation that registered was warmth, Not the searing heat of flames that had haunted her dreams, but the gentle embrace of fur blankets and a crackling hearth. She opened her eyes slowly, allowing them to adjust to the soft light filtering through a window covered with oiled parchment. The room surrounding her was unfamiliar, smaller than the great hall of Ravnheim, yet more finely appointed than any chamber she had occupied during her captivity. Carved wooden panels lined the walls, their surfaces etched with intricate knotwork patterns and scenes of ancient myths. A fire danced in a stone hearth, casting shifting patterns of light across the ceiling beams. The bed beneath her was soft with furs, and woolen blankets dyed in rich blues and greens. As her senses gradually returned, she became aware of another presence in the room. Turning her head slightly, mindful of the lingering weakness in her body, she found Ragnar seated beside the bed. He looked different from the fearsome jarl she had come to know. His hair and beard had been neatly trimmed, and he wore a simple linen tunic rather than his usual leather and mail. Most striking, however, was the expression on his face as he watched her: relief, concern, and something deeper, more profound, that she hesitated to name. "You've returned," he said softly when he saw her eyes focus on him. The usual commanding edge had vanished from his voice, replaced by something almost tender. "Where am I?" Freya asked, her throat dry and voice weak from disuse. "Safe," Ragnar replied, reaching for a cup of water near the bedside and gently supporting her head as she drank. "We are in Hedeby at my sister's holding, far from Ravnheim." The memories came rushing back then. The midnight attack, the desperate flight through flame and smoke, the final confrontation in the courtyard. She attempted to sit up, only to be halted by a sharp pain across her back. "Be still," Ragnar cautioned, his large hand gently pressing her shoulder back against the pillows. The wound was deep. "You've been walking the boundary between worlds for 7 days. 7 days, she echoed, trying to absorb the passage of time. "And Ravnheim? Ulfar?" A shadow crossed Ragnar's face. "Ravnheim stands, though half in ruins. As for Ulfar," his jaw tightened momentarily. "He lives for now, and claims the Jarl's seat, but his triumph will be short-lived. When I return, it will be with loyal warriors at my back." Freya studied his face, noting the barely contained fury beneath his controlled exterior. "You shouldn't have risked staying with me," she said quietly. "You should have gathered your forces immediately." "You shouldn't have risked your life for mine," he countered, his tone suddenly fierce. "Yet here we are, both having made choices that others might question." The silence that followed held the weight of all that remained unspoken between them. Questions of loyalty and sacrifice, of duty and desire, of what might exist beyond the roles of captor and captive that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Ragnar broke the silence first, his voice dropping to a register so low she had to strain to hear him. "You shouldn't have risked yourself for me. I am not worth the price you nearly paid." "You didn't think I should die that night," Freya replied with simple conviction. "Why should I have thought any differently about you?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean. Raids, battles, vengeance taken against innocents who shared nothing with my enemies but the land of their birth." His eyes returned to hers, haunted by ghosts of past deeds, including your village. "I know what you are," she said softly. "I've known since the beginning." "Then why?" he demanded, frustration breaking through his usual restraint. "Why save the man who destroyed everything you knew? Who took you from your home as a peace offering? Who—" "Because I saw something else as well," Freya interrupted, her voice strengthening with conviction. "I saw a man who could have taken anything he wanted but chose restraint, who could have killed without thought but chose protection, who had every reason to harden his heart forever but somehow found the courage to let it soften again." Ragnar fell silent, the truth of her words striking him with greater force than any physical blow. After a long moment he reached out, hesitantly, and took her hand in his, the first time he had touched her by choice rather than necessity. His massive palm dwarfed her slender fingers, yet he held her with such gentleness it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You taught me what my gods never could," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "That love is the greatest courage a warrior can possess." The admission hung between them, fragile and precious as the first spring blossom pushing through winter's final snow. Neither moved, neither spoke, each afraid that the wrong word or gesture might shatter this delicate new understanding. Finally, Ragnar cleared his throat, carefully releasing her hand. You should rest. When you've regained your strength, there are decisions to be made, by both of us. What decisions? Freya asked, already feeling exhaustion pulling at the edges of her consciousness. Whether you wish to return home, he replied, his expression carefully neutral, despite the cost such control clearly demanded. I will arrange safe passage if that is your desire. Home. The word echoed in Freya's mind, conjuring images of her village, the familiar faces, the simple rhythms of life she had known since childhood. Yet strangely, the longing those images once evoked had dimmed, replaced by a different kind of yearning. She realized with startling clarity that home had become something more complex than a place on a map. It had become a feeling, a presence, a sense of belonging she had found in the most unlikely of circumstances. I will consider it, she said softly, her eyes already beginning to close as healing sleep reclaimed her. Days turned to weeks, and winter's grip gave way entirely to spring's gentle touch. Freya's strength returned gradually, first allowing her to sit up, then to stand with assistance, and finally to walk the small garden adjoining the house where they had found refuge. Throughout her recovery, Ragnar remained close, though always maintaining a careful distance, as if uncertain of his place in this new chapter of their intertwined story. She learned more about him during these quieter days than she had in all the months at Ravnheim. His sister Sigrid, mistress of this holding, shared tales of their childhood, of a boy who had once rescued injured animals, who had wept at his first hunt, who had defended weaker children against bullies. Stories that revealed the foundation upon which the warrior had been built, the heart that had been buried but never truly destroyed by grief and violence. In turn, Freya spoke of her own past, her father's stern but loving guidance, her mother's early death, the simple joys and hardships of village life. She did not speak of her father's final betrayal, but Ragnar understood the omission and respected the wound it represented. On a particularly fine morning, with the sun warming the newly awakened earth and birds filling the air with songs of territory and courtship, Freya found Ragnar in the garden, staring thoughtfully at a cluster of early flowers pushing up through the dark soil. You seemed lost in thought, she observed, coming to stand beside him. He didn't look up immediately, his gaze still fixed on the delicate blossoms. I was thinking about impossible things, he replied. About flowers that survive winter, about hearts that endure grief, about enemies who become... He hesitated, searching for the right word. Something more? She suggested quietly. Something essential, he corrected, finally turning to face her. The man who stood before her now bore little resemblance to the fearsome jarl who had once terrified coastal villages. His eyes had softened, the harsh lines of his face eased by something approaching peace. My scouts bring news, he continued, his tone shifting slightly. Wulfar's hold on Ravnheim weakens. Many who followed him have grown disillusioned with his leadership. They remember their true jarl and await his return. He paused, searching her face. I must go back, reclaim what is mine, restore what was broken. Freya nodded, having expected this moment since her recovery began. When do you leave? Tomorrow, at first light. His voice remained steady, though his eyes betrayed the question he couldn't bring himself to ask directly. I have considered your offer, Freya said, answering the unspoken query. To return to my village. Ragnar's face remained carefully neutral, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or the steeling of oneself against inevitable loss. And I have decided, she continued, reaching out to take his hand as he had once taken hers, that some journeys are not meant to circle back to their beginning. Understanding dawned slowly across his features, hope cautiously rekindling behind his guarded expression. You would stay? Even knowing what I was? What I've done? I would stay, she confirmed, knowing what you were, what you've done, and most importantly, what you've become. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool morning air. You taught me something too, Ragnar of Ravenheim, that even the coldest winter eventually yields to spring. When dawn broke the following morning, they departed together, not as captor and captive, not as jarl and slave, but as equals bound by a bond forged in fire and tempered by understanding. Behind them, they left Freya's father's betrayal and Ragnar's years of frozen grief. Before them lay Ravenheim, awaiting rebirth from its own ashes. In the years that followed, the fortress transformed. Gardens sprouted where training grounds had once dominated. Children who had known only the clash of weapons learned songs of peace alongside tales of valor. Former raiders became traders, building bridges between cultures once divided by fear and bloodshed. Orphans found homes, widows found purpose, and warriors found that their strength could build as readily as it could destroy. And at the heart of this transformation stood the unlikely pair who had made it possible. The Saxon healer and the Norse jarl, known throughout the northern lands as the Lady of the North, the woman who had taught a warrior to love again. Freya's father never returned to claim her, never sought to mend the bond his betrayal had severed. And she, in time, ceased to be the trembling girl forced into a stranger's hands in a village square. She became instead something entirely new, stronger, wiser, and finally, completely free. From the darkest betrayal emerged the most unexpected light. Freya's journey reminds us that true strength isn't found in weapons or walls, but in the courage to remain standing when everything and everyone has fallen away. Would you have found such resilience if torn from everything you knew? Could you have seen beyond hatred to find humanity in the eyes of your captor? Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in how transformation often begins with a single act of defiance, not in loud rebellion, but in the quiet refusal to surrender one's spirit. The Viking jarl discovered that all his conquests meant nothing compared to the territory of one human heart freely given. In our own lives, how often do we mistake power for strength, possession for love? If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing it allows its message to reach others who might need these words today. Like Freya's song that penetrated stone walls, stories have the power to break through our own barriers. Follow for more tales that challenge, comfort, and remind us that even in our darkest winters, spring waits patiently beneath the snow. Leave a like if you believe, as the Lady of the North taught us, that love truly is the greatest courage a warrior can possess.